and get started. Hopefully you all just didn't hear my computer make a real loud noise. But welcome to session 3 of 4 of our Farm School for Women program. We greatly appreciate you all for being on again with us this week, and hopefully you'll stick around with us for our very last session next Tuesday evening. Again, it'll be at 6 o'clock next Tuesday evening, and the topic next week will be cattle health. We'll have Dr. Michelle Arnold on with us that evening. You'll see in the picture, hopefully y'all can still see my screen, and those that already heard me talk about this once, just ignore me, but you will be referencing tonight the grazing stick that you received prior to the Farm School for Women. Also the loose publication you can see on top of the blue folder in this picture, that will also be relevant to tonight's topic, which is rotational grazing systems. And other than that, if y'all have any questions, please let us know. You can put it in the chat box, or you can send it to us via text message to one of the agents, and we can definitely ask it. Or you at the end, or if Morgan has any little stops throughout, you can definitely come off of mute and ask it at that time. Because as of right now, everyone should probably be on mute, because I've got the meeting set up that way. That way we can keep down the background noise, because it does interfere and makes it hard for others to listen. So, of course, we hope you enjoy this evening, and we'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Morgan Hayes. She is our assistant extension professor with the University of Kentucky. She's with Biosystems Engineering. And also, I also forgot to mention one other person. The Grazing Sticks did come from Mr. Richard Bowling with the NRCS. He did donate those to us for you all. So if y'all see him out and about in your counties, please thank him as well. But other than that, Dr. Hayes, we're glad to have you on, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, April. So as was mentioned, I am an agricultural engineer. I work in livestock systems primarily, so I do a lot of work on livestock facilities, farmstead planning, those types of things. And personally, I live here in Boyle County, so that's where you're seeing me from today. And I live on a farm. My husband and I farm about 500 acres here in the county, and we have cattle and alpaca. And so I do, to some extent, practice what I preach. We won't always say that everything is perfect here on the farm, and I have some examples that are not perfect from my farm, because I can easily point out the mistakes that we've made. Also, I welcome questions at any point. There's no need to hold them all the way to the end, and if they're in the chat and I see them, I will try and stop and answer them as we go along. So thanks for being here with us. Let me go ahead and find my screen to share for you guys. There we go. Okay, so rotational grazing systems. I'm going to probably spend most of the talk really focusing on what a rotational system, how we plan for it and design and build one, because the engineer in me says that that's probably where I can probably provide the most help. But before we even get into doing that, I think it's really important to start with what a rotational system is. And rotational grazing is developed by subdividing large pastures into 2 or more small paddocks and grazing them in a planned sequence, providing rest periods for the plants while other areas of the field are being grazed. And once all of the paddocks have been grazed, then the sequence restarts with the first pasture so that the rest periods are as long as possible. This is subtly different than something like, say, strip grazing, which we're not really going to cover today, or continuously grazing one large pasture for the whole season. And the big thing about rotational systems is they provide a lot of benefits on the farm. And probably the most important benefit that people will talk about is the efficient pasture usage. When we give animals a large space and we don't ever rotate them, we don't efficiently eat all the grasses across all the pasture. We can use rotational to get more efficient usage more even coverage of a large field by making the animals move into different areas and eat it down more evenly. One of the other interesting things that has been shown is that actually we get better gains out of the animals when they're in a rotational system. So a lot of times people are focused on the animals in a rotational system, and this is the very clearest, most direct response from that pasture to pounds of gain that we get out of our animals in these fields. We also get healthier forages. The forages really thrive under a rotational system. Most of our grasses and legumes do significantly better when they get rest. And as a result, we actually get stronger stands that are more established, that last longer, that have better coverage over the whole field. We get less bare areas in our pastures, which is wonderful. And as a result of those healthier forages, we get less weed pressure. So this is really nice if you're trying to manage your pastures and not have to spray all the time or clip as often. If we can get our rotational system set up correctly, we can really improve the quality of the pasture and actually reduce some of the labor involved in managing those weed pressures as well. And then we also have the opportunity to improve soil health. And this one I think is a really interesting one that people don't always think about. Those strong root structures that come from our plants in our rotational system improve the soil structure. But the other thing that happens is we get that uniform grazing by those animals and we get manure across more of the field. And it really can result in more even distributions of nutrients across the fields and healthier soils across the whole area, which is really sort of maybe not your first thought, but might be one of the more valuable aspects of using a rotational system. And so if I've convinced you that you want a rotational system, I don't know that I have. I would say personally, I didn't really understand the benefits of a rotational system until I went and saw some farms in person that had been operating a rotational system for a few years. And you could see the quality differences in their pastures compared to a neighboring pasture on a farm, that's only 100 feet away. And you could see clearly the improvement in productivity out of a pasture that was part of a rotational system versus one that was continuously grazed. And having started using rotational grazing on a couple of our farms, I would say in 2016 and 17, we are finally really seeing the benefits of doing that rotation right now. So there's some immediate benefits, but there are some benefits that are going to show up a couple years down the road in terms of quality of forages and days that you can graze. And those kind of benefits are really going to continue to build upon for the first few years that you run a rotational system. But the first thing you really need to do to get a rotational system going is set it up. And this can be sort of an overwhelming task. So I'm going to use the majority of my time today to really talk about setting up a rotational system. And the first part of that is getting water. This is sometimes the biggest challenge in putting in a rotational system is making sure we get water in all of our pastures or paddocks. And there's two styles of watering systems that can be used with rotational. The first is permanent watering systems, and the second is temporary. In most cases, if we're trying to set up our rotational system, we're probably going to try and figure out how to put water into each one of those pastures, which often means that we need to use city water to do it, which means we end up with something like the tire tank water on the left or the frost-free ball type water on the right. However, some people can utilize naturally occurring waterways, streams, ponds, things like that. I will say that we're not looking to give free access to whole stream banks because it will erode them, nor do we want to give them full access to ponds. There are designs that would allow them safely to access an area of naturally occurring water. And if we have those in some of our fields, that may be a strategy, especially if we have a farm where bringing water to the back is not economically feasible. Sometimes we can develop ponds or springs to feed into other watering tanks in a really effective way. But there is cost associated with permanent watering systems. This is my farm, one of my farms. Here's an example of it. But I wanted this farm broken up into a large number of small paddocks. And it was intentional. This farm is not one that I want to create hay on. I have no desire to run hay equipment on this farm. It's very hilly. I have a lot of rock outcropping on this farm. And I think it's a prime example of a farm where a rotational system really provides some benefits. The challenge was there was no water on this farm when I purchased it, other than right up by the road, close to where water tank 1 is listed. And I had to run all the water line that you see here to be able to put these water tanks in to make this farm function the way I needed it to with a rotational system. And there's a major cost involved with putting in permanent watering systems. I made the decision to do so exclusively because I work off the farm and I don't have time to move water around every couple of days as I rotate my cattle. As well, I knew I might winter some cattle on this farm, and I have some concerns about freezing with a watering system that is temporary. So I went ahead and invested in the water lines here. One of the things, I have a couple pictures in here that you'll see like this. These are all pictures from Google Earth Pro. And if you have interest in how to use that to lay out your farm or how to record some of this information, feel free to email me and I will send you a link to a presentation that sort of talks a little bit about using Google Earth Pro to do this kind of layout. I think it is a really valuable tool for doing these kind of layouts. And between your cell phone and Google Earth Pro, you have a really valuable toolbox to keep electronic records for building a rotational system. Temporary watering systems are also pretty commonly promoted with rotational systems. The benefit of a watering system that's temporary is that we can move around where we put the water depending on where we put the fence. With a permanent system, we're forced to keep the water in the same spot, and most likely that means the fences can't move around very much. With a temporary system, we can move based upon the time of year and the amount of forage. We can change the size of our paddocks to make our rotation work the way we want it to. It requires having some heavier black plastic pipe, typically above ground, although it can be below ground, and some quick connect couplers to be able to bring that water up into different locations depending on where we want to place those water tanks. We can even do it off of spigots, so frost-free spigots, where that water will backflow out when we don't have it hooked up to a hose and running in a tank system like that bottom picture shows. For anyone that's really interested in doing a rotational system, specifically wants to look at temporary watering, I would strongly encourage you to go to one of the grazing schools that are typically offered in the fall and the spring. It's a 2-day school, but they really will do some hands-on work looking at temporary watering systems. The other thing I want to just briefly mention with regard to water, because it is pretty critical to the system here, is getting your water tank sizing right is really a challenge. And tank sizing depends on the flow rate of water through the pipe coming to the tank and the number of animals that need to drink from the pipe. And the goal is basically that all the animals in your herd have to be able to drink their water within 4 hours. And so sometimes people need to put in a really big tank because water flows really slowly and they want to make sure there's enough capacity in the tank to get all those animals watered in that time slot allotted. Usually it's 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon. to get the whole herd to drink. However, sometimes you can make good strategic decisions when you lay out your farm to be able to get more water, say to the back of the farm, by putting in bigger pipe, which then means you can put in a smaller tank. This is really valuable, especially if you know ahead of time what you're doing. You can really make smart decisions to keep water pressure high, to be able to fill up a smaller tank at the back of the farm and not have to have, say, a 500-gallon tank at the back of your farm. You can get away with a 100-gallon tank. There are 2 extension publications I've listed here. And the second one I think is sort of an interesting one. It's specifically about tire tank waters, but it has a really nice calculation in it there for figuring out how large of a tank you would need and how much you might lose pressure on a line by running it to the back of the farm. And so you might not instinctively look at it if you're not thinking about a tire tank water, but the AEN 133 is really a nice calculation to figure out what size tank you would actually need as well. I'm going to go on to fencing now, but were there any questions about watering systems while I'm here? Didn't see any.
If y'all have any questions, just make sure you put it in the chat, or during the breaks, feel free to unmute yourself.
I'll go on to fencing for a minute here, and you guys can think about if you have questions about some of these things. Fence planning. For me, fencing is one of those major costs, similar to putting in water lines, that can be really challenging when you're starting to figure out how you want to run a rotational system. And one of the questions I often really struggle with is, like, what size should the pastures or my paddocks be? And should they all be the same size? I think instinctively we believe that every paddock or pasture should be the same size so that we can rotate all of our animals and it'll be the same number of days in each paddock. The challenge is that, one, the paddock doesn't look the same in May as it does in August. So the number of days is not a given, even if they all are the same size. And 2, the soils and the geography of your land is not necessarily going to make all of that make sense. It would be nice if every farm was a perfect rectangle or square, and we could divide it into perfect rectangles and squares. But realistically, most farms aren't built that way in Kentucky. And we usually have at least one fence line that is curved or steps in and out. And that is just normal for this area of the country. So not everything is going to be perfectly square, even though it would be really nice if it was. And a lot of times we have a lot of narrow farms that are narrow and long, or that have a really aggressive ridge and hillside. And some of those hillsides aren't really practical for putting up fencing. So we have to set up our pastures according to how the land lays, and that is somewhat contingent on your specific farm. The other thing that I think a lot of people don't always consider is, are all your animals together all the time, or do you need different size paddocks for different groups of animals? And the example I always use is my bulls, because I run a breeding season, my bulls come out of my cow herd after 2 months, and then they don't go back in for another 4 months because I run a fall and a spring group. But I need to have paddocks for my cows, and I need to have paddocks for my bulls when they're not in with the cows. And my bulls don't need the same size paddock that the cows get. So I can have some smaller lots in the front for my bulls, or some lots for when I wean my calves. And they don't necessarily need to be exactly the same size as the ones that I need for my cow herd on a typical rotation. So one of the real challenges is trying to figure out how this works, especially if you're just starting a rotational system, to figure out how to break it down. So the strategy that I really am in favor of, and I encourage people to try, is to create good perimeter fences on your boundaries of your farm, and possibly 1 or 2 interior fences. and then use temporary fencing to create smaller areas so that you can manage those pastures. And really, even if you'd like to move to permanent fencing, for right now, it's a great idea to start out with some temporary fencing on the interior because it gives you a lot more flexibility in the short term. And you can start to figure out whether or not that location for a fence makes sense. It also gives you the opportunity to figure out where your gates are going to go. Some animals naturally don't like to go somewhere, so they don't always like to be pushed down a hill, especially a steep hill. They don't typically like to go through the gate in the middle of a fence line. They like to go into a corner. It's usually easier to push them that way. And while cattle, horses, sheep, anything that you're running on a rotational system will learn how the rotation works and move through gates more easily, you will inevitably have some small animal that will not follow its mother, like a calf or a colt, or and you will need to be able to push that animal through that gate. And so having that gate in the corner can be really important. And these temporary fences give you a good opportunity to make sure that that gate is in the right spot when you put a permanent fence in. The one thing about temporary fencing that people will say is, yeah, but it's one wire of hot and that's not enough to keep my animals in. For most animals, one wire of hot is enough to keep in an animal once it's trained to an electrified fence. As long as the fence is truly electrified and that wire is at the right height. So the one thing I want people to know is that there are a lot of different options for electrified fencing out there on the market. And even some options you can see on the right-hand side of this picture that would allow you to put multiple strands in, which is particularly useful if you've got adult and juvenile animals together in a pasture. There's also a lot of materials out there on the market that you can use to electrify temporary fencing. And some of them are just standard metal wire. There's like aluminum wire, which is usually a fairly high gauge, like a 17 gauge or higher, aluminum or steel wire. There's also a lot of poly wires and poly ropes and poly tape, poly ribbon, all those terms. The benefit of the poly materials is twofold. One, it is easier to manage if you have to roll and unroll it. And the second benefit is it's typically a little more visible. So they're typically designed as a white or a yellow material so that they can be seen by animals in the pasture so they know where this temporary fence is located. These poly wires and poly ropes have good visibility, but some of them do not have great lifespans. So if you're looking for one, you're going to want one that's going to handle UV light well. Some of them will break down over time, and others tend to be more robust. They are portable. Typically, the poly ropes and the poly wires will wind up easier than the poly tape. However, you can, with a geared reel, wind up the poly tape as well and move them to a new location. The one thing I will say about these poly wires and the poly ropes is that they have a lot of resistance. Their conductivity is not as good as, say, a traditional high tensile 12.5 gauge wire. And as a result, you will really need to make sure that you have the right size Energizer and that you're not overloading your fence with too much resistance. So part of that electric fencing system is that you need to figure out how much wire you need to energize. And as I said before, all the wires have different capacities for carrying current, and poly wire in general will only run about half as much distance as a steel or aluminum wire will. So you're really not going to get as much fencing done with poly wire as you could with steel or aluminum. There are a lot of different energizers on the market, some that are solar paneled and some that plug in to the wall. Those fence chargers or energizers that plug into the wall are much less expensive. So if you have AC power on your farm, I would strongly encourage you to be looking for a plug-in energizer. But if you don't, the solar paneled options are absolutely a good option. They work extremely well, and they've gotten much better at building those solar panels. The other thing I do want to point out here is you can see on the right, the one fence charger there says 50 miles. I'm not sure how they come up with these numbers. It seems to be on a company by company basis because there is no standard way to calculate the mileage for these fence energizers or chargers. So a 50-mile charger does not necessarily cover 50 miles of fence. But I will say if you had an option of a 50-mile charger and a 25-mile charger by that company, you could probably safely assume that the 50-mile charger had about twice the capacity of a 25-mile charger. So that might be how you might gauge the importance, the size of that fence charger. And also keep in mind that if you're using polywire or polyrope, you need it to be a low impedance model so that we don't end up with fire. There's two ways that electric fencing is done. In the case of a single wire temporary system, you're using an earth return. If you're using electric fencing also on your perimeter, you could use either an earth return or a wire return if you had multiple wires set up. I only mention this difference between the earth return and the wire return because if you have small ruminants, and I have alpacas, I mentioned that briefly at the beginning, sometimes you might look at a wire return for more permanent fencing, only to make sure you get a good shock on those small ruminants. And with that fencing, the last thing I want to mention is all of this fencing that I'm promoting is electrified fencing, and the most critical component that often gets mismanaged on an electric fence is the grounding system. It's really important to get the grounding right because that's what creates the variation in electricity that allows it to shock an animal to discourage them from going through that fence. So we really need a proper grounding system if we're going to run an electrified fence. And that means we need 3 ground rods, 6 feet in the ground, 10 foot apart. And ideally, we put it into moist soil if it's at all possible. So sort of my last sort of thought on this fencing, and the reason why I'm a big fan of getting your perimeters right and then using temporary fence in the center is the real interesting benefit is if we put in a good permanent fence and we have some form of electricity on the inside of that fence, a hot strand on the top or the inside of that permanent fencing, not only does it allow us to move around our rotational system as we need it, based upon the time of the year and the number of animals in the group that we're moving, but it also protects that fence from pushing and rubbing and leaning that a lot of these animals will do, that tends to wear out fences faster than they need to. So if you have the opportunity to really think about somehow running your electricity around your permanent fence, there are some real advantages. The other thing it does is it means you don't have to move a solar box and ground rods to different areas of the field depending on where you're running these temporary fences. Is there any questions at this point from anyone else on fencing and watering? I'm not seeing anything. Okay, I'll keep going. So shade. This is one of those areas that's often overlooked, and it can be a real challenge because it's not easy to get shade into a paddock or pasture very quickly. There's not a lot of options out there for fencing or for fencing for shade, excuse me. Most of us assume that we're going to use trees as our primary form of shade in all of our paddocks. It tends to be cost effective. We do readily have trees in most of Kentucky, so that is not usually a hard thing to find. But as we move to a rotational system, we do have to be strategic in how we lay out our paddocks to make sure each one receives shade, especially in the afternoon hours. Sometimes we have fields that get really good shade, but they only get it in the early morning hours, and by late afternoon, there's no shade at all. And we have to sort of be cognizant of that when we lay out these pastures, that in the heat of summer, it can be significantly detrimental to these animals to not have shade in those late afternoon hours. So ideally, we would have trees. Sometimes we have buildings. Sometimes we have run-in sheds, or we already have an existing building or something in there that creates a shaded area, or we allow them into the building altogether. And there are portable shade options out there. This person's using them for rotating poultry, which is, not something I've ever done, but I think it's pretty cool. And I think at least they're cognizant of the need to provide shade for their animals, so they have found a portable way to move the shade as they move their animals around in different paddocks. So this is an example here from one of the farms that we run. And the farm currently has two existing, when we started running on the farm, it had 2 water tanks right near some barns in the center of the farm. And it had 2 cross fences that were semi-permanent. So I left them there in red. And the back field, the one all the way on the left, the furthest from the road, is actually the field where we would bale hay. So we made the command decision not to do any fencing in the back. And we need to figure out how to put a rotational system in the front 2 pastures. And so the first thing we did was build some new fencing in the second pasture, because this is where our winter lot happens to be. And so we built this farm so that we now have a winter lot on the bottom of the field. And we moved the water as well at the same time, because it was in a spot where it got a lot of erosion, because it was a very heavily used area on a hillside, and it just didn't hold up well. So we moved the water tank up to the top of the hill. And then we also have a second water tank in the other pasture. So we have 2 paddocks in this central field. But ideally for the rotational system, we would want another 3 to 4 more paddocks in the front field. I don't know if anyone here is willing to jump up and say what they would do if they had to add. How would you think about adding a rotational system in that front? Anyone want to venture a guess? No? I'll go ahead and talk about this then. So this front pasture, instinctively, the easiest way to fence it, and what makes the most sense when you look at it, is to put a cross across the fence. So to run 1 vertical and 1 horizontal fence line across that fence. But the challenge with doing that is there's no trees in this front field. You can see here that there's a road, there's a driveway. Yeah, Sarah says she cut her paddocks into wedges with the water in the center of the large field. That is ideally what we would do. We would put a water tank in the very center of that field, and we would then start working outward from the center of this field with our different paddocks. But the challenge is right now there's a set of trees here, and then there's another set of trees on this fence line here. And this is truly west out here. So we're actually getting our afternoon shade coming into the field off of these trees, and small amounts of shade off of some trees right here, but the trees really only go up the hill a little ways. There's no trees from here all the way around the front of this. And while we might eventually get a tree or two to grow in this field, this is the only tree currently in the center of this field. And so the decision was made when we went ahead to do fencing on this place to cut 2 fence lines across the field in this direction. And it's not ideal. We don't live under any delusion that this is the most efficient way to cut up these fields, because while it is less than 800 feet from the water to any corner of the field, they don't graze it as evenly as we would like. All of their tree line is on the side closest to the barns. And in the heat of summer, they graze that half of the field significantly more than they graze out by the road. And so we have to sort of overgraze one end to graze the other end, or undergraze the end out by the road. So this is a rotational system, and it is a way to do it. And honestly, if we really needed to utilize that pasture, we might even have to strip graze it to try and force them to graze that field a little bit more evenly. But it is a challenge. So I won't say that it is always perfect, but for us, it was a priority to have some form of shade in all of these paddocks. And as a result, this was the best solution we could come up with. And for labor, I don't have a lot of slides here. I just wanted to have a little bit of discussion about labor. Figuring out how you're going to operate a rotational system and how often and how much time you're willing to put in is really going to help you decide how you're going to make the system work. There are labor challenges with putting in permanent watering and permanent fencing. And there are also challenges with putting in temporary water and temporary fencing. The initial cost and the initial time to put in water and fencing can be overwhelming, especially when you're starting a rotational system. However, the day-to-day time to move water and fencing can also be challenging. And one of the things I want people to think about is that even if you put in a permanent system, it doesn't mean that there's not maintenance involved with having those fences and those water tanks in place. You still have to go out and work on the system to make it operate the way you want it to. It's just less intensely necessary at an exact point in time, where if you have animals in a rotational system and you have temporary fence or water, you will know that that is part of your daily chores because you move those animals on a regular basis. And the more often you move the animals, the more labor involved in that process. The grazing sticks, I think, are really a useful tool, not necessarily in that they completely save labor, but if your other option is to go out there and cut samples and weigh them, the grazing stick is certainly a faster option. I don't know here. Let me go ahead and play this video for you about how to use the grazing sticks. You will have the extension publication on using the grazing sticks in your materials, and then you will have your own grazing stick with you. And they are a useful tool. I will say as you get more and more efficient at using the grazing stick, you will have to use it less and less. You will better be able to determine how your pastures are performing just by driving out and looking around in those pastures. But as you start with the rotational system, the grazing stick can be really a very efficient way to go ahead and check how much biomass is in those pastures for those animals to eat.
Welcome back to another episode of Georgia Forages, the digital series. My name is Dr. Lisa Baxter, and I'm your University of Georgia State Forage Extension Specialist. Today, we're going to learn how to use a grazing stick to make forage management decisions and predict the amount of available forage. Let's start by looking at how to properly use a grazing stick. If you don't have a grazing stick or pasture ruler, you can use any sort of ruler or yardstick for these measurements. Start by walking across the field in a diagonal or zigzag pattern and take a height measurement every 10 to 20 steps. Place the grazing stick upright at the bottom of the plant canopy. Put your hand against the stick where the top of the plant canopy and the height of the marking stick meet, but don't press down on the forage. Write down this number and repeat it across multiple locations in the field. To minimize error or bias, be sure to take readings at consistent spacings across the field, such as every 10th or 20th step, to avoid selecting only tall spots or areas just inside the gateway. Keep the ruler perfect.
Ah. I'm sorry, guys.
Full height, as this can cause a lot of error. To predict the available forage, we need to first add all of the height measurements together and divide by the number of measurements collected to get an average height in the pasture. We will use this height to represent the beginning grazing height. Look at the table provided to determine the optimal final grazing height. For Bermuda grass, this would be 3 inches. Subtract the final height from the beginning height to determine the inches of available forage. Next, let's look up the pounds of available forage per inch per acre. You will notice that there is a range in the available forage estimations in this table. This range accounts for the density of the stand. If the stand only has about 50 to 75% of the ground covered, then use the lower end of the range. If the ground coverage exceeds 90% though, we can use the higher end of the range. Multiply the pounds of available forage per inch per acre by the number of inches to get the pounds of available forage per acre. Let's try a few examples. In this Bermuda grass stand, the average height was approximately 18 inches. When we subtract the final grazing height of 3 inches from 18 inches, we get 15 inches of available forage. Bermuda grass has, on average, 260 pounds of forage per inch per acre, but can range from 150 to 500 pounds. We are just going to use the average for our calculations today. So if we multiply 15 inches by 260 pounds per inch, then we have 3,900 pounds of available forage per acre. This alfalfa dominant stand is about 11 inches tall. Ideally, we would have about 4 inches of residual forage left after grazing the alfalfa. So here we have 7 inches of available forage. From the table, we see that an alfalfa or alfalfa grass mixture has 225 pounds of forage per inch per acre. When we multiply 7 inches of available forage by 225 pounds of forage per inch per acre, we find there are 1,575 pounds of forage available per acre. Now let's use our grazing stick to allocate forage or animals. First, we need to define utilization and forage intake. Utilization is the percent of available forage that the animal will actually consume. As intensity of the grazing rotation increases, so does utilization. Dry matter intake is determined by many factors, including class of livestock and their condition. We generally expect that animals will consume 2 to 4% of their body weight. For our examples in this video, let's assume that we have 100 dry beef cows that weigh 1,000 pounds on average. These cows will consume 2% of their body weight and are being rotationally grazed on a 10-acre Bermuda grass pasture with 4,000 pounds of available forage per acre. So let's start by determining how many days it would take to graze this pasture. To determine the days of grazing we need, first multiply the available forage per acre by the number of acres and percent utilization to determine the numerator in this equation. We will then multiply the animal weight by their percent intake and number of animals to get the denominator. When we divide the numerator by the denominator, we get the days of grazing per paddock. And so using our real numbers in this example, we see that this pasture would last for 12 days. Another possible question is, well, how much area do I need to feed my 100 cows for 7 days? To determine the number of acres required, multiply the average animal weight by the percent intake, number of animals, and days of grazing. We'll then divide this number by the product of available forage and percent utilization. Using our numbers in this example, we need 5.8 acres to hold these 100 cows for 7 days.
Okay, sorry about that. I didn't mean to press that button in the middle there. But I think that's a really nice overview on how the grazing stick works. And most of the grazing sticks will actually give you a pretty good indication on there of your utilization numbers, as well as an expectation on pounds per inch per acre. I find them to be a very quick tool to use in the field to quickly assess how much grass is there. And even more so than figuring out the number of days, I think they're particularly useful if you're doing a rotational system to just go out there and gauge what the average height for that final height is like. Sometimes it's hard, especially the first few times you're running a rotational system, to really see the amount of grass that's out there. Because your eye instinctively is either looking for areas that are too low or areas that are too high. So walking randomly and taking spot measurements every 5 or 10 steps as you walk across a pasture is a really nice way to gauge how tall the grass is on average across a field. So before I finish up here, I wanted to do some typical pasture layouts, some options for a rotational system, just so you can see some different examples, and then I'll try and answer some questions. The central water setup as a heavy use area with the pie-shaped wedges coming out around it is a really common design. And it's the most efficient design, especially on farms that are fairly square or at least have width to length ratios that make sense for one water tank. Plus, you only have to install one water tank, which is, from a cost perspective, a real bonus. So this is a design where you would have the water tank in the center, and then you'd have 4 paddocks with gates on the corners, and the fence lines going into the center. This is a perfect example of a farm that's using a centralized water tank with 4 paddocks around it. This one actually, I think, is maybe a little bit more efficient even on the fencing with regard to the design as compared to the first design. So at the end of each of these fence lines, there's actually a gate just coming into the next fence line. And that allows you to run all your fence lines very efficiently and only put those 4 gates in there, and you don't have quite as many corners or braces with this type of design. This farm has these 4 paddocks, and then it also has an area over here that can be part of this 4th paddock, making it a little bit larger, or it can be split off if you needed to use that area for storage, or if you wanted to use that as, like, say, a winter feeding area and you didn't want to give them access to it all the time. So that's a pretty nice design for a central water tank. I think most people that are doing rotational systems and they can figure out how to put in a central tank don't contact me, because when I look at all the designs I've done with other people, I typically have an alleyway in a system that I'm helping someone build because their farms aren't really laid out for a central, a perfect central system. This is an example of a farm that I helped with for feeder cattle. So this person was bringing in feeder cattle, and they do have a centralized water tank, but they couldn't get all of their pastures to directly feed into the water tank. So instead, the design was built with an alleyway so that the animals would have to use the alleyway to get to the water tank from some of these specific pastures. This is a pretty interesting design. Just the way the ground was laid and where some sinkholes were on this farm, it really made, it really determined where the fence lines were going to have to go on this farm, which is how they got laid out, as you can see here in this picture. And you'll also see that there are some smaller and some larger pastures in this picture. And that was intentional as well. One of the challenges is that the fields towards the road at the top of the picture had better grasses in them. The fields at the bottom have a lot of sinkholes and rougher ground, and they don't perform as well. So one, they didn't want to have the water line running into that area where the ground is less stable. But also they didn't expect those animals to be able to spend as long in those pastures at the bottom of the map. So it's designed to allow for a rotational system. And the alleyway is designed to allow animals to work amongst the fields. The other thing that alleyway does is it allows them to bring up cattle that need to be treated or handled at the working facility. And this design was specifically done for feeder cattle, which sometimes will show up with some disease issues that you might not see in a mama cow herd. And so they really wanted to have an efficient way to move those cattle back up to the barn if they did have to do any work. This is a second farm with an alley system, where the other one was designed with a centralized alley. This one is designed with an alley at the bottom of the screen. And that set of trees that's just above that alley there is actually a creek. So this is sort of the bottom ground at the bottom of the field, and then all of the paddocks that are designed in this picture were specifically designed here to follow some tree lines and to follow the slope of the ground so that the fence could run more easily down the hill. One of the reasons you'll see some of these sort of unusual fence lines here is because they didn't want to break up the trees or destroy the trees in order to run straight fences, but they wanted to ensure that every field had shade in it. So these are specifically laid out to ensure that each one of the fields has shade for the summertime. And then the other thing that happened with this design that I think is interesting is they put in a winter feed pad down near the bottom because they know that they have some sloped land that might be erodible. They wanted to have a plan in place for how to feed their cattle in the wintertime. And so as a result, they actually put in a winter feed pad at the bottom of one of these pastures to specifically try and reduce wear and tear and erosion in their rotational system. That is something that is not always a forethought, but figuring out, especially with a rotational system, where your sacrifice area is or how you're going to feed those cattle so you don't destroy those pastures you're working so hard to improve can be a really important step in the process. And this is a rotational system with an alley for feeder cattle as well. This is a much larger farm, which you can tell because all of these paddocks are 20 or more acres for the most part. But this was a feeder setup where they wanted to be able to bring in feeder cattle into a barn to feed them. And actually they were expecting to run 2 groups of feeders on this farm. So this design is actually set up so they can bring them in for multiple paddocks within the same day. They'll just bring in different animals at different times. But again, this alley system is a really nice design, especially on a farm where you can't figure out how to centralize everything to be able to easily move the cattle without having to bring the cattle back through a recently grazed field where they might overgraze the fresh tender grass that you're really trying to encourage to grow. So even though alleys tend to be annoying in the sense that they require some labor to maintain them, to mow them, to maintain the fence lines on them, they do have some advantages, especially if you're going to move cattle regularly or you work cattle often or other animals. If you work them often, an alley can be a real advantage to move animals from the back of the farm back to the front or to the working facility where it's located. And so with that, I would take any questions.
If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box or unmute yourself. Hey, Doc, while they are getting revved up to ask questions, let me ask you one. Go back to electrical fences. And you said the trick is to put your ground in a moist spot. Any tips when that moist spot turns dry in August?
Well, you can always water the spot if you're really concerned about it. But the reason that we put the 3 ground rods 6 foot in the ground is because it does create enough surface area, even if it's not dry, even if it is dry, you should still have enough contact with the soil to be able to discharge. It's the reason people who typically have problems when it's not dry is they either don't have all 3 ground rods in the ground, or their ground rods are too close together and they're all trying to discharge to the same piece of soil and there's not enough capacity in that soil to take all that charge, or they're not using ground rods. So they're using something like a T-post, or they're using a piece of rebar that's rusty. A good galvanized ground rod, 3 of them, 6 foot in the ground, will discharge in this area. Our soils are not such that we can't discharge with 3 for most of the fences here. If you're over, I don't know, 1,500, 2,000 feet, you might have to add another ground rod in the system because it's just a little too far away. But for the most part, 3 ground rods will do it even in the driest weather around here. The benefit of a moist soil is if you cheat and you only put 1 in off of a solar box, you're probably okay if it's wet. But realistically, to ensure across the whole year, the 3 ground rods, you won't really need the moist soil here.
I guess a little housekeeping while we're waiting on some questions. Don't forget about next week will be our final session. And then we will also send out a survey, hopefully with the email that reminds you about the meeting. And we definitely want your input back as far as how did you think about this system as delivery and some future topics as well. April, do you have any other house cleaning items?
I can't think of anything. Again, if anybody has not picked up your grazing stick or your hand lens that we used on the very first session, just contact your county agent and I'm sure we can work with you to get those items. Other than that, if no one has any questions for Dr. Hayes, I mean, right now you're welcome to come off of mute and ask any questions. She had a lot of great information. I know we get a lot of questions about rotational grazing, so this was very beneficial.
And we did have a couple people come in late, which is perfectly fine. I should have this posted up on YouTube on the Plant Professional webpage, and I will send that link to April, and we will get it emailed out to you in the next reminder.
One thing I would say to anyone who is thinking about rotational, and I know county agents are going to love this, but it's worth spending the time to print out your map or go to the FSA office and get a map and draw out what you're thinking about, and then talk to someone else that's done rotational systems, whether that's your county agent, whether that's a specialist or a neighbor that's is doing a good job with rotational systems, and ask for feedback. See if they have any thoughts about what you're thinking about doing before you invest in putting in the fences and the water lines, because there is a lot of cost associated with it. And I think you should do it. I'm not discouraging you from doing that, but getting the feedback before you make the investment, I think, is a really great thing to do, because something will always be suggested that could improve a system.
Yeah, you're not going to make the county agents mad, Doc. I welcome the opportunity anytime because a different set of eyes is always helpful.
Absolutely.
Well, we do get a couple of questions, Doc, coming in the chat.
I see that. So what is the best grass legume species for grazing in this area? So across the board, the legumes are going to do a lot better with a rotational system. They do not handle continuous grazing well, any of them. So any of the clovers, you probably aren't grazing your alfalfa. It's unlikely you would be doing that. But any of the clovers or the lespedizas, any of those things are not going to do well under continuous grazing. So that they'll really thrive under a rotational system. And similarly on some of the grasses, some of our grasses can handle continuous grazing better. Fescue actually doesn't have as much a problem with it as things like orchard grass or bluegrass. Some of those grasses tend to struggle with it, I think. So you will be able to pick the grasses that you want based upon the what you want in your pasture and maintain it better with a rotational system. It's not necessarily that you would have to choose different grasses, but certain ones are going to actually really thrive in this system that might not be able to really establish as well. And I am not a forage expert, so you will have to contact your forage specialist for exactly which grasses you're going to want for your animals. But your agents will be able to help you with that as well. And Sarah said, since we started rotational grazing, we have decreased the time we've fed hay significantly. Yes, I think that's probably the biggest thing about a rotational system. Not only do we get more grazing, but if we're really good about it, it's these fall months when everyone else starts to feed hay and we know we still have a week in this field and a week in that field and a week in that field. And we're into December where other people are starting to feed hay in the middle of October, that the real benefit of a rotational system becomes visible to us as farmers.
Yeah, and Sarah does a really good job with rotational grazing.
She's the one you should have review then. She probably can give people. Oh, Lori. My degree is in agricultural engineering. I in fact have 3 degrees and they all have different titles, but I call them all agricultural engineering. Biosystems and agricultural engineering at UK.
Well, last call for any more questions. We hope you all enjoyed the program this evening. And just one more reminder, we got Dr. Arnold on next week with beef cattle health protocols. Doc, thank you for your evening. We appreciate you sharing with us. Ladies, if you need anything, feel free to get a hold of your county agent. We'll be glad to assist you however we can.
Thank you all so much. Thanks, Dr. Hayes. It was pretty awesome.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.